Okay, today this is the second class of personal injury law. We're going to jump into actual torts themselves. We're going to start looking at the torts and going through one by one, describing each of them and kind of getting to know them. Torts is one of those areas of law that it's just fun. There are lots of bizarre cases, bizarre circumstances, and they just lend themselves to interesting things. It's very important that you read the book. What we're going to be going over today in class, we're going to just briefly go over some of this, the subject matters for those who are more visually attuned. But for the most part, we're following the same things that the book is using, and it's a real good book, so go ahead and read it and make sure that you understand the material. I'm going to have a discussion board put up, which I'll require all of you to participate in, to ask questions, to put in more information that you might know or be familiar with. But also, importantly, to look at the book and ask questions that might confuse you in the book and the like. All right, let's jump in. Today we're going to be talking about intentional torts. Intentional torts are really, out of all torts, is probably the easiest. Maybe strict liability would be a close second as far as easiness. Intentional torts, in the definition of intentional torts, or in the word or phrase, is the key to intentional torts. An intentional tort is, by and large, an intended action. It has some intent behind it. Now, remember, we are talking about torts, and this is personal injury law, so we're talking about the civil side of things. We're not talking about the criminal side of things. In criminal law, if you've taken a criminal law class or if you've heard about criminal law, in criminal law, you hear the word intent. Well, this is a different kind of intent, and it's good to keep the two separate. So if whatever you're learning or have learned in criminal law, keep that separate from what you're learning in this class. You don't want to confuse the two. The reason, or the main reason, the intent in this case with an intentional tort is the intent to bring about the consequences, not necessarily the harm. And that's really important, because in criminal law, when we talk about intent, we're usually talking about a circumstance where someone's, contemplating murdering someone, and they'll go through the actions and finally give themselves the intent to commit the murder. Well, in intentional torts, what we're talking about is just bringing about the action that causes the consequence. Practical jokes, for instance. Practical jokes gone awry can easily fulfill or satisfy the elements of an intentional tort. If you're, let's say, you want to surprise someone. So as a practical joke, you put a spider or a fake spider or something in front of them, knowing that they're arachnophobic. Well, your intent is a practical joke. Your intent is just to scare them. Ha ha ha, funny. Well, by scaring them, they have a heart attack and die. Sorry, intentional tort. The joke went awry, but your intent to put the spider there to cause a reaction was exactly what happened. The outcome wasn't quite what you expected, but that's not what we look at when we come to intentional torts for the most part. Another, I guess the sneakier thing with intentional torts to keep in mind, because this will apply to all sorts of torts, is the transferred intent doctrine. The transfer intent doctrine works for a good many of the torts that we'll learn about. And what transferred intent is having the intent to do something, to have a consequence, to act, to have a consequence toward one person, and it ends up acting against or toward another person. So let's use the setting down the spider example. You're going to play a practical joke. You're going to set down a spider and scare Uncle Jim. Well, instead of Uncle Jim sitting down in front of the spider, Aunt Jane sits down in front of the spider. She sees the spider and has a massive stroke and dies, or a massive heart attack and dies. Well, the intent was to put the spider there to scare Uncle Jim. That action to bring about the consequence is transferred to whomever it actually occurs to, even if you didn't foresee it. It's putting things in motion. You put in motion that practical joke, and you should know better. You should know that it might affect someone else, that someone else might come along and be the victim of that practical joke. Just because it wasn't Uncle Jim that got scared by the spider, it doesn't mean that it's any less of an intentional tort. The intent to affect Uncle Jim is transferred to Aunt Jane or to whomever else would sit there and get scared by the spider. When we talk about intentional torts, we're talking about effects to people, to persons and property. Those are the two categories that we're usually going to be talking about. Either a person gets damaged in some way, injured, killed, maimed, whatever, or property is going to be damaged or destroyed or made inactive in some way. Now we're going to go and walk through some of these, the usual intentional torts. Each of these intentional torts has a long history and some very simple theories behind them, some very simple principles behind them. And once you get them down, it's pretty easy to recognize what they are. But there's some big ones, so you'll need to know them. The first one is battery. Battery. Again, separate what you know about criminal law and separate what we're learning about personal injury law. Battery in criminal law is different than battery in civil law. They're not much different, but they're different enough to confuse you. So just understand that there are two types of batteries. And we're also going to learn about assault and false imprisonment. These two could have a criminal component or a criminal liability attached to it, but just know that they are separate. You have to keep them in mind that way. Now, battery is the intentional infliction of harmful or offensive